knowledge. I just got them from him.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lorraine Belmont, and I teach English here at NIC, and I'm happy to welcome you to our convocation presentation today. I'm very delighted to introduce Ann Dunnigan to you. Ann has been a long-time resident of Coeur d'Alene. She has lived here since 1917. Her whole family has been involved with both Coeur d'Alene and NIC and the history of what has gone on in this country. And as a matter of fact, the carillon that you hear every hour and every 10 minutes into the hour was dedicated to Ann's sister, Loretta Dunnigan. Ann is a historian who currently works with and has for many years the Museum of North Idaho. She is also the historical chairperson for the Centennial for Coeur d'Alene this year. She has had many honors from North Idaho College. She told me that I didn't need to go through all of them, so I won't. But in addition to that, she has had many honors from the community. There is much physical evidence that has been written about Fort Sherman. I think one of the nice things about having Ann here today is that she has seen it grow personally and can tell us some of the more romantic sides. Ann.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I can't say that I'm a complete historian. My sister was much more of a historian than I, but talking with her many years ago, we did discuss a great many things about northern Idaho and all about Coeur d'Alene and Fort Sherman. She wrote a paper on Fort Sherman, and I'm going to use that as my material. She also wrote a book on the history of Coeur d'Alene up to 1910, and I'm going to use that also as part of my material. She wrote this book and did a great deal of research. She went to Spokane, to the library there, and in their Northwest section, and did a great deal of research. She researched it for about 5 years before she wrote the book. And I know there's a great deal written about Coeur d'Alene, but it isn't all put in one book, and one volume wouldn't hold all of it. So you have to pick and choose what you want to put in your book. I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe for about 15 minutes, and tell you the history of Fort Sherman, and then I will show you some slides. These slides are from the Museum of North Idaho, and they are available for others to use too. A grant was given to the museum, and one of the young men took pictures. They took pictures of books and pictures, and he had a great resource to make these slides. Let us think back about 140 years ago. On this property, the first teacher on this property was probably Father De Smet. Father De Smet met with the Coeur d'Alene Indians right here on this property by the Spokane River and the Coeur d'Alene Lake. They wanted the Black Robes to come. The Black Robes were the Jesuit fathers from St. Louis. They had come to the Flathead Indian Reservation. The Coeur d'Alene Indians had heard about them, and they asked to have them come for 2 years before they were able to send someone. And this territory at that time was very primitive. There weren't any roads, and so Father De Smet met the Indians on this property in 1842. They wanted to learn to pray, and he taught them how to pray 3 different prayers. They sent out word to all the Coeur d'Alene Indians to come and to gather. He could only stay 3 days, so he got the little children together and taught them one prayer. he put them in a circle and taught each one of them a phrase and told them to stay in that formation and to repeat that phrase until they memorized that prayer. Then he taught them the next prayer, and this he taught the adults. And the next prayer was the Our Father, and they too were taught to stand in a circle and repeat the prayer until everybody knew it from memory. And they also taught, the last one was the Apostles' Creed. The Indians loved Father Desmet, and he promised that he would send back another priest to be with them. He sent back Father Point 2 years later, and with him Brother Hewitt. The first mission was on the St. Joe River, north of St. Mary's. It did not last many years because of the weather, and it flooded. So they moved it to the old mission, and there they built the first church that is still standing in Idaho, and it is called the Mission of the Sacred Heart. The Indians built this along with the Jesuit brothers, and there are no nails in this building. Maybe many of you have seen it. It is a national park, and if you haven't seen it, do go to see it sometime. It's up near Kellogg, between here and Kellogg on Highway 90, I-90. Then they moved the church over to DeSmet because at that time they wanted to put the Indians on a reservation, and they called it the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. There are many stories about how Coeur d'Alene got its name, but many of them are very similar. Then comes the time when they needed a road through this country, and Captain John Mullen established this particular road. And the 4th of July Canyon was named 4th of July Canyon because on the 4th of July they were there building the road, and they inscribed into the tree, the Mullen tree, the 4th of July, and they had a big celebration. Camp Coeur d'Alene was established as the result of a military order dated April 16, 1878, issued from the headquarters of the United States Army, District of Clearwater. This action was the result of recommendations from General Sherman, who during the previous year of 1877 had visited this section of the Northwest to determine what new Army posts were needed to protect the settlers in event of more Indian hostilities. And this was shortly after the Nez Perce War. Traveling over the military road of Mullen Road, which has been completed some 16 years before, connecting Fort Walla Walla in Washington Territory and Fort Benton at the head of navigation on the Missouri, the general made visits to the Sacred Heart Mission on the Coeur d'Alene River, which is now called the Old Mission, and it still stands near the present village of Cataldo. Then coming on to Lake Coeur d'Alene, he chose a site for the new Army post. That section of our present city, now commonly referred to as the Fort Grounds. According to military plans for the control of the Indians, this new fort was to be one of a chain of 3 smaller ones, 2 others being Fort Spokane, located at the junction of the Spokane and Columbia Rivers, Fort Colville, near the present site of the city of Colville, Washington. General Sherman relates his experiences in many letters. Congress has accepted General Sherman's recommendations, set aside 999 acres of land as a military reservation, which extended from the shore of Lake Coeur d'Alene northward along the east side of the Spokane River. This land is now occupied by the North Idaho College, the city park, the county courthouse, the forest cemetery, and many privately owned areas. Soon after the establishment of Fort Coeur d'Alene, Camp Coeur d'Alene, it was named Fort Coeur d'Alene. Fort Coeur d'Alene was a well-built stronghold for defense. A more strategic location could not have been selected. It commanded a view of the lake around which shores renegade Indians might stalk. It was the guardian of the Mullen Trail, where a watch could be kept on all travelers. Its beautiful site, ideal climate, gave it an atmosphere that was unusual to military posts. In 1878, just 1 year after General Sherman made his tour, the fort was established. Fort Colville and Fort Lappaway were abandoned, and the troops were transferred to the new fort. General Merriam, formerly of Fort Lappaway, was the first commander, but he was, after a short time, transferred to Fort Spokane. The command was then turned over to Colonel Wheaton, who was later to General Randall, Lieutenant Cook, Colonel Carlin, Colonel Hall, and lastly to Colonel Thacker. There were generally 4 companies stationed at the fort at one time, making the number somewhere around 250 men. From time to time, companies were transferred to other forts, and other companies came and took their places. In 1887, Fort Coeur d'Alene was renamed Fort Sherman in honor of General William Sherman, who founded its location and was responsible for its existence. In 1896, the 4th Infantry was transferred to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and on the same day, the 16th Regiment came to Fort Coeur d'Alene from Fort Douglas, Utah. The fort was a busy place in those days. Living quarters had to be built, since there were no buildings whatever. There was plenty of food, there was plenty of wood, so a sawmill was immediately put up to get the wood in shape for building purposes. Letters taken from the books in which records were kept at the quartermaster's office reveal many interesting facts. The first quartermaster was James Ulick, but he seems to have been transferred in less than a year, and his place was filled by S.C. Clark. In one of his letters written to the Chief Quartermaster, District of Columbia, dated May 17, 1878, he writes that a sawmill was ready to be cutting, but progress could not be made without white and red lead, waste lard, oil, and flour of emery. There must have been trouble in regard to the workings of the mill, because he mentioned that the belt had been cut one night. Many of the soldiers were skilled mechanics. These men could receive $100 for such employment in civilian positions. S.C. Clark wrote to the quartermaster at Vancouver asking for $224 to pay extra duty men to be employed for such work. Constructing buildings to house the 100 recruits who were to come to the fort. Extra duty pay was between 25 and 35 cents a day. From the report of the inspection in 1883, there were the following buildings: 4 company barracks buildings, 1 building for the regimental band, 1 regulation building, 1 commanding officers' headquarters, 7 company officers' headquarters, 4 commissioned staff officers' quarters, including a school for children, 1 building for the commanding officer, adjutant, quartermaster, quartermaster subsistence storehouse, 1 guardhouse, 1 chapel and library, 1 bakery, 1 sawmill, 1 blacksmith shop, 1 carpenter shop, 1 plumber shop, 1 granary, 1 stable for the quartermaster, 1 stable for 4-pack mules, 1 stable for the cavalry, 2 hay sheds, 2 ice houses, 2 kitchens, 1 building for the officers' storage, a recreation hall for the enlisted men. When the fort was abandoned in 1901, there were 52 buildings in all. At the opening of the fort in 1878, there were to be fed 68 mules, 3 ox teams, 3 4-horse teams, and 5 public horses. When General Sherman again visited the western fort, letters were sent to Fort Coeur d'Alene, Fort Colville, Spokane Falls, and Deep Creek, ordering that grain and hay for one or several days should be on hand for his train of 50 horses and 50 mules. That was in 1881. Hay and grain were first brought from Rosalia, Steptoe, Walker's Prairie, Spokane Falls, Chewelah, Spangle, Pine Grove, Deep Creek, and Colfax, Washington. Apparently, the winters were long and cold. In 1880, there was an order for 23 heating stoves and pipes, 110 caps, 82 gauntlets, and a number of buffalo coats. With the exception of 2 occasions, the soldiers lived the regular Army life at the fort until they were called to take part in the Cuban War. When the Northern Pacific Railroad went into the hands of receivers, the troops from Fort Sherman were called out to guard the rail. Again, in 1891, when martial law was declared in the mining districts because of strikes, the troops from Fort Sherman were called into action and went to Wallace. Then, in 1898, came the call to arms. For some time before the call came, the soldiers of the fort were told to hold themselves in readiness to go to Cuba. At that time, the fort had 5 companies of the 16th Infantry, consisting of about 350 men, 12 officers. On April the 21st, under the leadership of Colonel Thacker, they were carried by railroad to Spokane, and from there to New Orleans and on to Cuba. A small detachment of 11 men, under the direction of Lieutenant Buck, was left to care for the government property. After the Cuban War, the post was never regularly garrisoned. The troops, after returning from Cuba, were sent to Fort Crook, Nebraska, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. There had been efforts to abandon the post prior to this. In 1894, the lake and the river had risen to such an extent that the post was flooded for several weeks. However, the principal reason for its abandonment was the lack of railroad facilities. In April of 1901, the reservation was turned over to the Interior Department, and the detachment at Fort Sherman was sent to Fort Wright. The government set aside the property of Coeur d'Alene, 20 acres for a city park, 20 acres for the cemetery. The Stack and Gibbs Lumber Company bought much of the land, and that's where the Northwest Timber Company is now. In the summer of 1905, the reservation was sold at public auction. Today, the reservation consists of one of the most beautiful residential sections of Coeur d'Alene. The Little Red Chapel still stands in its original position. Many of the officers' home can be seen on the way to the college. Not now. Many of them have been taken down. The hospital and the opera house were moved to 10th and Indiana, then torn down to make room for the new IHM High School. The Sisters Convent is now the school administration building for School District 271, and the high school is Sorensen Elementary School. I attended there for 12 years, and I attended in the old building that has been torn down. I have some slides I'm going to show you, and if you have any questions you want to ask, you can stop me at the time of the slide, and if I can answer it, I'll be glad to. If you want to wait until after it's over, I'll be glad to answer any of the questions. The Amelia Wheaton was the first steamboat boat on the lake, and it was named after Colonel Wheaton. It was an 85-foot stern wheeler built by Captain Sorensen for the Army at the cost of $5,000. I read in a book recently where The engine had to come from the east, and it went around by Cape Horn and came up to Portland and up the Columbia and up to Fort Sherman. So it took a while to build it. It was necessary to have a boat so that they could get the hay for the horses from the fields around and from up at the Cataldo Flats. Much hay was grown there, and so they brought it for the horses. Here are some other little items. Tony Tubbs arrived in 1882, and he filed a claim which included a considerable portion of the hill south of the city, which bears his name, Tubbs Hill. And the first plat in Coeur d'Alene was made by Tony Tubbs. General Sherman came the second time in 1883 and visited the forts of the West, visited this fort. It was still called Fort Coeur d'Alene, and it wasn't changed until 1887. Some think that it was named Fort Sherman after General Sherman died, but it wasn't. It was named, he died about 6 years later after it was changed. I'm going to show you the slides now, and I'll turn off some of the lights. And let's make this informal. If you have any questions you want to ask, do. And I'm so pleased that so many of you are here today. I'm glad to see the faculty and the students and many of my friends from town. Yes?
Ms. Dunnigan, there are, down by the end of Public Street, there are a lot of pier walks running out into the lake. Do you know what that is?
They were probably for the log booms. And if they are around over here by the college, Lafferty had a mill, and he also had a transportation company, and they were to guide the logs and the log booms. Yes?
Isn't she speaking of the ones that go directly out into the lake at right angles, that are like a continuation of it? And I
The railroad.
That was the railroad.
The railroad, SI went on.
That was the SI Railroad. And it was Spokane International. And it was built so that the people and freight could come down from Canada. It met the Canadian Pacific up at Eastport and Yankee Sea and came down to this area.
They could load the steamers directly from the railroad.
Would you like to know the lights? You'll see some of these things that I talked about. I have to turn it off just a minute.
Leave that one on. There, that's it. This is a picture of General Sherman. Can you hear me? So I'll go back up the mic.
This is the famous General Sherman that came to northern Idaho to select this particular spot for a fort. He came from Fort Benton, Montana, and this is a picture of Fort Benton. This is one of the first pictures of the church at Cataldo. This is the wagon train that came on the Mullen Trail. See how they packed their horses. This is a preserved drawing. It came from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. of the old mission. And you can see how they did have much hay there. And boats from Coeur d'Alene would come up to the landing at the old mission. The inside of the old mission. This is Father Cataldo in his younger days. This is Father Cataldo and some of the Coeur d'Alene Indians later on in life. This is Chief Celtice and his family. He was the chief of the Coeur d'Alene Indians. These are some of the Indian women from the Coeur d'Alene tribe. This is a few years later, but if you imagine there are no buildings there, this is what this particular area looked like in about 1880. Tubbs Hill in the distance. This is the order that came. Yes? You have a question? Want me to go back? Am I going too fast?
Well, maybe just a little bit. Are you interested? Tubbs Hill is to the back.
Just like over there, it's over now. This is like taken from Blackville Hill.
Why did you point out where some of the things at the college are? There's a lot of people who relate that to.
I would say, all along here is the dike, and then back there is the college where we're standing now.
And if any of you want to add anything at any time, do so, please. Yes?
You can see the street that goes up there. I believe that's River Avenue, and it did go clean up to Lincoln Way at one time, the top of the hill there, and you can see where it's clear of the trees.
It used to be a bridge across
Across the river. Yes, I have a bridge of one. I have a copy of one of the bridge going across the river. That to me looks like it might be what we call now Garden Avenue, isn't it?
Garden, yes it is.
Garden.
Excuse me, not River.
Yeah, Garden Avenue. And at that time it was called Carlin Avenue, after one of the colonels. This is the order that came from Fort Lappaway to send the troops and Colonel Merriam up here to Fort Coeur d'Alene. And all of his troops, they closed down Fort Lappaway and brought them all to Camp Coeur d'Alene. And this is March 24th, 1878. This is Colonel Merriam, who was the first colonel at the fort, and he was here less than a year. These are his officers. Notice the uniform. Now this is his staff, the first staff of Fort Coeur d'Alene. These are the officers and their wives and some children.
So we go around town.
Yes.
Is that from the top of
No, I think it's further down than the McHugh House.
Okay, that's the
At first they came and they lived in tents for a while before they could build the buildings. This is the first sawmill. This is one of the first buildings on the fort. Now, of course, these are a little later, about 2 years later, after the fort was built. This is the entrance, and it's down someplace on Garden near where the ball field is. The building over at this side to the left is the guardhouse. The little white building is the mortuary, and then the other building is the hospital. another similar one taken at a different time. You have a replica of this gate over here. It was built for the, I believe, 700 or 75 years.
Mrs. Dunnigan,
Yes?
I noticed the soldier appeared to be a black soldier, is that true?
They did have at one time black soldiers here, especially during the time when they sent the soldiers to Wallace during the uprising there. Now this is looking the opposite direction. This is looking east. This is looking east. This is the guardhouse. This is the cavalry returning from practice. These men are ready to go hunting. So they had recreation as well as work. This is the commanding officer's house. It was built over closer to the lake. Right now there's a vacant lot there. When the fort was abandoned, it was bought by T.T. Coeur, one of the millionaires of Coeur d'Alene at that time. He had a family of 3 children who lived there. Another picture of a commanding officer's house. Likewise. The first man over here is John Fernand. And John Fernand took care of the fort after it was abandoned. He took care of it for about from 1901 to 1906 when it was auctioned. He then left the fort and took up a homestead out of Fernand Lake. Fernand Lake used to be called Trout Lake. And not only he took up, excuse me, what's happening? He not only took up 160 acres, but his wife also took up 160 acres of land. And so they had Fernand Lake and Fernand Hill and all that area. This is in 1887. Thank you very much. And this is along Garden Avenue. Sure, I can back up a lot.
I just want to make sure people realize that that is the building that was called McHugh, and that we just got changed that to be entitled Old Officers' Quarters. That is the one remaining building from the original Officers' Row. It is still on campus.
Are you gonna push for a porch like that and put it back on?
What?
Are they going to restore it like that?
There's been talk of doing that eventually. Of course, there's no money for it right now, but I think that that is a possibility. At some point, they've also talked about putting a big fence in.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
But that makes that building along the chapel the oldest buildings in North Idaho other than the county.
And there's also one other building on the campus, the Powder House. And that was an original building of the fort.
Was the church also, Mrs. Dunnigan?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But we do have a museum over there, and I hope that everybody can stop and see the museum, not today, because it doesn't open till May 1st. But before school is out, do come down and see it. It's one of the favorite parts of our museum. The other museum is on Northwest Boulevard, and it will open on April 1st. And the ladies now are dressing the mannequins in the style of in the 1880s. And down at the bottom here it says Fort Coeur d'Alene, 1887. If I go too fast, do stop me, please. Yes.
We saw a picture or two of the gate, the
Mhm.
long road. Is that at the gate?
I'm not sure, but I think it is. Mhm.
Sorry, tonight we can see that.
We will see some more.
There was a picture, a couple of pictures of the house in the back, there's a big hospital in the background of the gate, but then there was a picture looking the other way through the gate. And what we saw was a long dirt road, really long. I wondered if that was right.
They say that if you lined up all of Garden Avenue, it would be about 2 blocks out of the way. It wouldn't really, at first, when this was Fort Sherman, this was Carlin Avenue. But since then, they've called it Garden. Now, this is the hospital again, and it's in 2 parts. This is Dr. Sador. He was the physician at the hospital. And this is the medical corps at the hospital at this time. This was the Opera House and the Post Exchange. When you, like the PX they have now. Part of this building was also moved up to 9th and Indiana as part of the Academy of IHM in the early days. This is the 1st Infantry Band of Fort Coeur d'Alene. This is Captain Sorensen, who built the Amelia Wheaton. He was a civilian, and he had a contract with the government to build the boat. And this is a picture of the boat. They not only hauled hay on it, they had excursions many times on Sundays and other times for the officers and their wives and the military people. This is the stable that was built for the horses. This is where the post office was and the commissary, and also storerooms on each end. These are more barns that were built and storehouses. This is some of the barracks for the non-commissioned people. This is the men at the fort starting for a parade.
Is that the church in the background?
Yes, that's the little chapel.
And that's about where the Headland building is then approximately, the Headland parking lot, that's all.
No, it's across the street. It's across the street where the chapel is now. This is an overview picture of the fort in the early days. People just out for a walk. This is the water tower. And for a while they got their water across the river up on Blackwell Hill. But there didn't seem to be enough pressure, so they built their own tower and a water pump. Here is the chapel, and you can see it in location with the hospital. This is, after the fort was abandoned, the chapel looked like this. But the Athletic Round Table bought it and preserved it. Many churches use this. It was built, I'll show you this. This is the chapel in use. And on Sundays, all denominations use this church until they built their own church, like in the 1890s and the 1900s. some of the local churches were built at that time. They used it during the week for a school. And there's an interesting little story. The first teacher was one of the cavalrymen by the name of Billy. And they appointed him as teacher, but it was very difficult for him to have discipline in the school. So, and they also noticed he was a funny-looking character because he had bow legs. And so the children would nickname him Billy Bowlegs. But he only lasted about 3 months. And then the commanding officer appointed another teacher who was a very excellent teacher. And his name was Medgrave. Then they needed a school. And so they built this little school next to the chapel. And this was the first school in Coeur d'Alene and on the grounds here. Last night I was talking to a lady, and you can see a lady in a white dress over here, and then this is the teacher, Mr. Medgrave. And she said that was her aunt, and she graduated from college, and she was just doing an internship at that time in that school. And many of the local citizens were allowed to come to the school too, and some of them were Robert Percival, Henry Rust, Emma Nichols, Mary Farrell, Mary Canfield, and many of the others. I cannot identify them, but they are in the picture. Then Coeur d'Alene established a school, and Isaac Daly was a new lawyer in town, and he was the first teacher. It was a log school over where the Roosevelt School, it is no longer, but where the building is, over on Wallace. And it was a little log school. The bandstand, on Sunday afternoons they had band programs. These are visitors at the fort. Now this probably is your Garden Avenue that you're thinking about. They're having a baseball game. In 1884, they had a big flood, and there was 2 feet of water all over this area, and they had to use boats to go from one building to another. It was caused by the logs jamming at the bridge of the Spokane River, so they had to get boats out to take the logs away from the log jam and float them down the river, so that the water would go down. This is Captain Bubb's house, and that's over on Garden. It's the block. The Communication Arts building is here, and then it's that next full block over there on Garden. And this is the house that was there. This house was moved across the street in 2 sections, and it was an apartment building, and I think it's still there. It was bought for $600 in the auction, and a woman by the name of Mrs. Eugene O'Rourke bought it. When the other men were bidding on it, and they saw that she was bidding on it, they wouldn't bid her any higher. So she got the whole block of property and the big house. And I remember it being there. And her granddaughter was a good friend. They had to build a dike. This area flooded once again in 1933. It wasn't as bad as the flood in 1894. But this is why they built the dike around, so the flood no longer. This is the order that came from Washington, D.C. on April the 12th, 1887, changing the name from Fort Coeur d'Alene to Fort Sherman. The other pictures, remember the one we saw? These are the guns and the flags. More guns, and this also is a Negro soldier. This is Ann Dunnigan, and she was the laundress at the fort. This is what the fort looked like in the wintertime. On this side, which is Blackwell Island now, there were Indians in camp there.
This is the hospital in that picture?
Must be. It must be. It might be one of those at the far right. I went to Washington, D.C. to the archives, and I did get the blueprint of the fort. And I didn't realize that there was going to be a bulletin board down here. I would have brought it, but I do have it available. And it tells you exactly where each one of the buildings are on this particular campus. We had snow in those days too. This is a shoveling detail, it says. And if you notice the name on the edge of the picture, these pictures were in the album at the archives in Washington, D.C. And I went there one time, and I asked if I could take the pictures, and everything was so well cataloged, they could send you to the exact spot. You could pick out the pictures, and they were all numbered, and they would take a picture of them and send it to you. And the other one here, we'll see him. I think that's Colonel Carlin. I think we're coming now to the 16th company, and this was the last company that was at the fort before the Spanish-American War. These are the officers. For Colonel Thaxter, the band, 16th Infantry Band. So we had both the infantry and the cavalry here. Officers. These are all named at the museum, so if you were interested in their names. This is where they are getting ready to leave to go to the Spanish-American War. They're marching over to the railroad station, and they take the railroad to Spokane, then to New Orleans, and then to Cuba. That is part of it. It looks like it's getting a little disbanded there. There's an overall picture of the fort. Now you can see where the hospital was and the different buildings. That's the end of that. I have a lot more I could tell you, but I'm sure that you, I have another film of early Coeur d'Alene, but I see we won't have time for it. But are there any questions? Yes?
Yeah, I got a little personal touch on it.
Yes. Yes.
My grandparents came from Switzerland in 1892 to Coeur d'Alene, and since grandma spoke only Swiss, she went to her French. She went to school Sunday, because she still was on duty on Sunday. And she stayed with them for about 3 years.
How interesting. There are many, many stories like that. When I was doing my research, some of the stories I read were written by Francis Cope, who was editor of the press, Major Wilkins, who was a historian, and he used to write an article every week for the Cooney County Leader. And I went to Spokane and I read so much more than what I can tell you today, that I'm sure it would take much longer. But if any of you want to see the pictures of early Coeur d'Alene, I'd be glad to show them. Yes.
I have a postcard at my pocket at home, which shows a Catholic girls' school here in town, 2-3-story building, blue building.
Yes.
Can you tell me where that was located?
On 9th in Indiana, that whole block. Major O'Brien bought it from the fort and gave it to the sisters. And then they brought the hospital building up by rollers, rolling logs and pulling it with a team of horses. I had an uncle who helped do that, and they erected it there. I have some pictures if you want to say it. I'd be glad to show you. Yes.
I'm Jim McLeod, and
Yes.
just like to let everybody know that we're going to try this year to establish a Fort Sherman Day here on campus, commemorating the establishment of the fort, April 16, 1878. The 16th falls on Saturday this year, so we're probably going to have to do this on Friday the 15th. I think it's on Friday the 13th. And, well, we have not planned this very much yet, but we're hoping to get some, maybe raise a flag with the fort that was the same vintage as would have been flown with the fort during that period. Possibly have some other exhibits and so forth. The students are thinking about wearing Western garb on campus that day, and so I'd like you to be aware that we're going to try and do this and make it an annual event every year to do this one day, at least for students to be aware of the fact that this was a fort at one time. And
What was the date again?
April 15th on a Friday.
I think that's an excellent idea, to carry on the traditions that were started 140 some years ago. Any other questions? You want to, I know you have to leave because you have classes. How many would like to stay and see early Coeur d'Alene? Right? I'd be glad to show it to you. I think it's very interesting. This is another picture of the fort. It's taken from Blackwell Hill. Yes, right there. Yes, this is a good picture. It shows that. Now this is one of the roads around the fort. This is the early lakefront of Coeur d'Alene.
Now, would that be the railroad, pier?
That's one. That's one of them. Got a couple of them. This is Lake Coeur d'Alene in 1889. Here are the piers that you're going to see, that you're talking about. Coeur d'Alene was incorporated into a village on August the 22nd, 1887. That's why we celebrated and it did say that 50 male inhabitants had to sign the petition before it could be a village. And it was incorporated under the laws of the Idaho Territory. But it didn't become a city until September the 4th, 1906. And then they used to call it Coeur d'Alene City. And they used the word city, Coeur d'Alene City. Another picture of early Coeur d'Alene. You can see most of it was right around the lake, the business right on the lake, because we were not on a railroad, mainline railroad. The mainline railroad went through Rafter. Yes?
Is the pier at the end of First Street then? Is that about what you're saying? Is that how you?
I'd say it's a little closer to Third.
A little closer to Third.
Do you know the function of that little round building to the left of the bridge there on the shore?
I have no idea unless we're bandstand of some kind of a entertainment area. Just above it, it was a hotel. And this building over here, the white building, was also a hotel. You can see the different piers and piling in there. Oh, this is the Coeur d'Alene Inn. It had another name before this one. It was the Coeur d'Alene Inn. And in 1906, they have the registration of everybody who stayed at the Coeur d'Alene Inn in 1906 down at the museum. And I looked through it, and I saw my father's name as he registered 16 times. It was before he was married, and he had the lumber camp up at Sand, Idaho. And so he'd have to walk from Sand into St. Mary's, take the boat down to Coeur d'Alene, take the train into Spokane and get the supplies, order the supplies. The supplies would be sent out, and then they would be put on the boat, and then met at St. Mary's with a wagon train and taken out to the camp in Sand. Another picture of the I think this must be, I think that's the Spokane River. There's the Spokane River. That Coeur d'Alene number, Gubby?
Was that the one that was right down where the parking lot is now?
That was the Coeur d'Alene number, yes.
Mrs. Dunnigan, you mentioned that the water originally...
I have a picture of it, pardon me?
You mentioned that the water originally came from Blackwell Hill. Did they just run a pipe right across
Yes, they
the
did,
bridge?
and they had a reservoir. They ran down into the ground, way down underneath the river. They had a pipe running underneath the river.
You know, we still get my water still comes out of that same spring.
Does it?
The water I use in my house comes out of that spring that they use.
That's right. It was up on Blackwell Hill, and up on Mrs. Ock's property. And I know the gentleman who helped to build it up there, his name was John Murphy. And he also planted the cottonwood trees that they're taking down now in front of the park. They were probably planted about 85 years old. This is Niggerhead Point. Taken from a postcard.
Is that where the river?
Now, you spoke about the school. This is Coeur Gulch School. But the first school in Coeur d'Alene was built over here by the Roosevelt School, was similar to this one. This is another picture of the same one. Out of Coeur Gulch or Meadow Creek, on that area. This is the high school. It was built up where the telephone building is now, on 7th and between Wallace and Coeur d'Alene. And it was burned down in 1927 during the Christmas vacation. And then on the corner they built the old Central grade school. This is a 3rd grade class in the old Central school. This is a picnic in 1891 from the children in the school. This is a picnic out at Fernand Lake. This is the bridge across the Spokane River. And logs were piled up against the piling and wouldn't allow the water to run under. And this is why they had the flood.
Where was that bridge?
Just right out here from river, right across from river. Across the Spokane River on River Avenue, down where the Armands Lumber Company is.
The bridge held, huh?
The bridge held. But they did have to tie ropes and hold it back with boats while they were pushing the logs under the river so that it wouldn't give out. Oh, this is a sign that tells about the Fort Sherman Chapel. And it just tells about, it was a non-denominational chapel built by the fort, the Army, and that it was preserved by the Round Table. This is a later picture of the chapel, and many denominations still use it, have used it, and there is a denomination right now using it. And many people had weddings there. Yes?
You know, that actually belongs, it's part of the museum now, it was needed from the Round Table.
That's right. The Round Table, when they disbanded, gave it to the Museum of North Idaho. So the museum has it now. At one time, they were going to move it over to Fort Wright, but it wasn't allowed to be moved. This is Martin Meacham. He was a bugler at the fort and an old-timer in town. As they say, this was one of the excursions. The electric line came from Spokane, and it came right out on the dock. And on Sundays, the people would come out by the hundreds and go on boat rides up the lake.
Do you know which boat it is? Yeah.
No, I have it back there, and I can't remember. I think it is the Idaho. This is a lumber camp. Here it is. Yes. This is one of the old settlers' homes. Also another settler's home, and I don't remember the name.
Would that be right in Coeur d'Alene or outside?
No, I think it was out just a little ways of country. However, they could have had similar homes to that, because when Coeur d'Alene was, there wasn't much to Coeur d'Alene before the fort was here. Then the people started coming. Then they opened this Indian land for homesteads. And they said they had 100,000 people apply for a homestead. And sometimes they drew them by lots. And this brought many, many people here. Most of them kept their homesteads, but many of them sold them. But you had to pay fees and other things. Sometimes it was $1 an acre, and sometimes it was $7.50 an acre.
And when was that? When it was opened up?
Yeah. I have a new It was about the 1890s. This was one of the buildings of the fort, and it was during Farragut days. It was remodeled, and it was an apartment house. And it was just down the waterway. It was torn down. It's where the parking lot is now. It was torn down by horseback. This was the McCormick house, and it was torn down a few years ago too, for the parking lot. Oh, this is the building. This is the Sisters Convent. It was a hospital of the fort and moved up. So the Sisters Convent is over there. That's where they lived, and they also had a boarding school for girls.
I think it's the other side of that building, from what the last word is on my dad's postcard.
Is that right?
It would be the other side of that view.
Yeah, I have another view too. On this side is the school, and the sisters, not having to come down and walk on the ground, they had a walkway built across from one building to the next. The school is on this side, the grade school and the high school. They built this brick wall for privacy, and also people would wander around at night, and they just wanted to be private. This is in the real early days. here they're getting ready to tear it down. And all the nails that were in this building and the buildings of the fort were molded, and they were square nails. And there's still a few available now. Pardon me? When was it? Sadie, do you know? When was the building torn down?
Well, let's see, Kenneth started in the new high school, and he started in 56.
So it was around that time that they tore down the convent. And you can just see a corner of the new high school right in between the two buildings. They had to build around the convent so the sisters could live in it. And they built around it. This faces 10th Street. Most of the fence, the brick wall is gone now, but there are a few sections of it still there. This is 4th Street, and during the Troop G from Fort Sherman paraded down 4th Street. And notice the buildings that were built at that time. There's the Wiggett building. There's one there. That's 4th and Sherman now. This is the Blackwell Mill, and that Blackwell Mill was over here on Blackwell Island at one time, and it employed a great many people in town. Many people had made their living there. They tore the mill down. This is the smokestack for the Coeur d'Alene Mill. And the Coeur d'Alene Mill was down where the city parking lot is now, at the foot of Tubbs Hill, and just right at Front and 4th Street was the entrance into the city, into the Coeur d'Alene Mill. This is the first post office and store in Coeur d'Alene. This was a livery barn on 2nd at Lakeside. This is, notice the telephone poles. At one time, Sherman Street, it was always named Sherman, but it wasn't the main street in town. Lakeside was the main street. And they had high walks that they had to, on Sherman, so that they wouldn't get flooded and the feet wouldn't get wet. The water came up to where the old Desert Hotel, where the First Security Bank is now. The Coeur d'Alene Lake came up that far at high water time. And where the North Shore, or where the Coeur d'Alene is now, that's all been filled in. Another excursion on the electric train. That is the Idaho. Another boat. Someone said they took the engine out of the Amelia Wheat and put it in the Idaho. This is the flyer on St. Joe River. And when I was a child, many a time I rode from Coeur d'Alene to St. Mary's on the flyer. I was born in St. Mary's and we moved here when I was a small child. The George Oaks was one of the most beautiful boats on the lake. This is the building that's still standing. It was the substation for the electric line. And it's still standing over there on Northwest Boulevard as you turn the corner by the museum. It was given at one time to the museum. But since they didn't allow the railroad to build the roundhouses on Rafter Prairie, they took it back. But they're still going to try and get it. And it would be a nice addition to our museum. One time they had a very serious train wreck. Two of the electric trains collided out at Gibbs. That's out where the Northwest Timber Company is now. The first, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Gibbs bought the property and had a mill out there at where the Northwest Timber Company is. It was the first mill in that area. I think, oh, there were several that were killed during that wreck. This is a farmhouse in the early days. Well, this is the Northern Pacific Railroad coming into Coeur d'Alene. But this was taken about in 1942. Oh, you can't see him, but he was one of the, his name was Wells, and he was one of the stage drivers from Coeur d'Alene to Radford before they had the trains coming. They had a special line coming in from Radford to Coeur d'Alene. Train crew. This was J.C. White's house. He built it in the early days when he was doing very well with the Red Collar Line Transportation Boat Company. And it's 805 Sherman, and a friend of mine lives there now who is Mary Bjorklund, so I put it in. They had many beautiful homes along Sherman, and many of them have been destroyed or moved. This is Mrs. Kercheval, and that was her transportation. Her husband was one of the soldiers at the fort. This is the monument for Fort Sherman that's over here in the city park. And this is the dedication of the room. And some of these men were at the fort. I think this is about 1930. Fritz's Corner used to be a cigar store downtown. I think that's probably what, on 3rd Street or 2nd Street? Sherman. 3rd and Sherman. And that's it. Any questions? Thank you very much. This is my first time to do anything like this, so I did enjoy it, and that's why I intended to do it.